I've been meaning to reach out to you, Daniel, about coming together and having a conversation about chainmail, which fortunately, Cerebrivore came along and Jason did the coordination for us. So now I get all the benefit of having that conversation without the
Right.
coordination effort. Yeah,
So your people called my people, but both of our people are Jason.
exactly.
Pretty much. I'm the people. Yep, that's right.
Most unlikely of villains, schools of brain and forepaws. Does it talk? Does it know how? Does it bottle? Does it meow? In the lair of the Cerebrivore, heaven showed him so much more. Release your brains at the door.
Welcome back to Cerebrivore. I'm your host, Jason, from the Nerds RPG Variety Cast. Today I have two guests. It's a small panel, but the small panel packs a punch. I have, well, actually, alphabetical order either way. We have Daniel of the Bandits Keep Media Empire, and we have Taylor of the Clerics Ringmail Media Empire. How are you gentlemen doing today?
I'm doing well.
I am doing just fine. We're in good spirits with high morale.
Excellent.
Oh, yeah.
Excellent. So today, folks, we're going to talk about chainmail and using it in your games. And this conversation is going to be a little bit free-flowing. Both Daniel and Taylor have been playing around with chainmail both by itself and kind of mixing it with OD&D. As you probably know, listener, OD&D was written originally with the idea of chainmail being the combat system. Then they had the D20 combat as the alternative combat, although the designers seem to mainly use that as their main combat. And by the time the first supplement came out, by the time Greyhawk came out, that was the combat system effectively. Now, this isn't a new idea. Jason Vey, I think, is probably the biggest proponent of this prior to these two gentlemen. He has Elf Lair Games. There'll be a link in the show notes to Jason Vey's stuff. Nowadays, his main push is Night Shift, which is a urban fantasy game. But prior to that, he's done a couple games. He did Spellcraft and Swordplay, which kind of mixes OD&D and chainmail, and he's done a couple supplements just for chainmail with the older rules, including one called Forbidden Lore that's pretty good, and all that'll be in the show notes. I guess my first question for Daniel and Taylor, and I guess we'll go to Taylor first. We'll do reverse alphabetical order since, Taylor being later in the alphabet always gets stuck in the back of the bus, is did you look at Jason Vey's stuff at all when you were developing your work?
I truthfully did not, unless Jason Vey is secretly also Gray Elf.
That he is Gray Elf.
He is?
Yep.
All right, then I did. Then I absolutely did. I picked up part of my drive to understand the original edition was driven by what makes OSR gaming different. And while I won't go into too much about my personal history, one of the things that's been constant through every iteration I played as a kid growing into adulthood has been the ACS, the alternate combat system. And so when I found out that chainmail existed, because my first exposure to chainmail was the 3rd edition reboot, which effectively was not chainmail. It was a D20 game. But then finding out the original chainmail, connecting the dots, remembering those lead clunky miniatures that used to collect dust at the local gaming shop next to the Warhammer, which they could never keep in stock, knowing that that was its own system, knowing that it was its own game, and seeing it integrate into an RPG, that was very curious for me. That was intriguing. And so that the drive there was finding that out, downloading Mr. Vey's Complia chainmail. I hadn't dug into some of the other stuff. Some of the friends that we have on the Audio Dungeon have been proponents of a couple different links to stuff that we can download that he had worked on. And so, having forgotten the question you asked to begin with, I had seen Complete Chainmail. I love that document. I borrowed a little bit from that for my cheat sheets. Planning to run a game tonight, given the opportunity. And I've got my DM screen on the wall behind me. I think you guys can see it, but
almost. You didn't go quite far enough.
it didn't go quite far enough. Let's see.
So for the listeners, Taylor's turned his laptop around, and he has the way his desk is set up, and there's a picture. In fact, I'll include a picture. I'll include a picture as the cover art for this episode. But he has where his laptop sits, and then there's 8 by 11 sheets of paper taped on the wall above it and around it that are his DM screen.
Yep. Nice. So yeah, some folks use cereal boxes. I use drywall.
It's tough bringing that to conventions though.
Yeah, much more difficult to get on the airplane.
Definitely. Daniel, were you influenced at all with Mr. Bay's work?
I definitely was. My friend Tony sent me, because he knew I loved Conan. He sent me the one using Chainmail to produce Conan, whatever the first one is. And he didn't even think of it as like a chain. He wasn't like, oh, this is a Chainmail system. He was just like OD&D and Conan. And weirdly enough, he's the first person who ever ran OD&D for me. We ran it on Gygax's birthday one year. I was like, I've never played. And he ran it. And I looked at this and I was like, wow, this is so interesting. And a big focus of my game, as we'll probably talk about, is the 3 different types of combat. And that right away struck me as something super interesting, because I always felt like there was something odd, like that I was missing in D&D, like, because of course, my philosophy is there's lots of different chunks, and you could, I'm on this whole immersion, everything has to be one unified thing. And that just really caught me. And then, so I kind of looked at what he had, then read all of his supplements he made, and then kind of started moving in my own direction, because I didn't like some of the things that he had done, which is exactly why we DIY stuff, right? We look at what somebody else did. We're like, that's amazing, but I would do it this way. And then we start creating our own system, which is pretty awesome. And theoretically, how Chainmail itself was built, at least the fantasy part, right? Because there's rumors that they had seen like this Middle Earth war game thing, and it's in like a pamphlet from some small wargaming club. And that's kind of where the fantasy part, Chainmail came from, because that's how it was back then. It looks like people were passing stuff back and forth. It wasn't until a lot of money came into it, I think, that, but we'll talk, maybe that's a whole other episode, that people started saying, I invented this, I invented that, right? It used to be people shared a lot more. Yeah, like the internet.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And yeah, I don't necessarily want to, I mean, if you guys want to just go down that road, we can. No, but I was more just because both of you kind of, you started kind of in the same place, right? But both of you had the original rules, and you'd seen this, at least some of the stuff Jason Bay did. And you said, this is the game I want to work on. I want to do my own hack of it. Maybe hack's a harsh word. I want to do my own version of this. That's going to, I want to make the most playable thing I can out of this, because I find it very interesting. And so I guess I'll throw the next one to Daniel, and then as the conversation goes, I'll butt out.
It's like a presidential debate.
Exactly. Like yes. The next question to the
I would not vote for me.
No, but so Daniel, I know you especially found, so you went in 2 different directions with this initially. You initially were doing a mix. You were going to include OD, you're going to figure out a way to use Chainmail as the combat system for OD&D, the way it kind of talks about in OD&D. And then eventually you kind of said, well, Chainmail is perfectly fine by itself. It doesn't even need OD&D.
Yeah.
How about you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, right. And I'll kind of just throw this aside to start with and we come back to it, is that I think I said in one of our earlier podcasts, I don't want this to be its own thing. I want it to be something somebody gets attached to OD&D. But what I realized was, and I'll get back to your question in a second, that it is like a presidential debate. I mean, saying what I want to say. What I realized was that as you start to make changes to any system, it goes deeper than you think. So I ended up, now I'm creating a whole system. But right, at first I was like, cool, instead of just OSR type characters with 3 hit points and everybody attacks the same and everybody uses the same weapons, they all do the same damage. Instead of fixing that, I'm doing a lot of air quotes for some reason, by adding like variable weapon damage and all this other stuff that they added in like Greyhawk and stuff, and those kids in Greyhawk. Chainmail did that. It really gave you the idea that weapons made a difference when they needed to, right? When you're fighting with 50 orcs on the field, do you really need to worry about it too much? A little bit, right? But when you're fighting man to man, it makes a big difference. And it's really fun to really have the weapons make a difference. And that's when you see that, sure, all the weapons do a D6, but that dagger doesn't do so well against a plate mail, but the fighter can use a two-hand or sword and really do some damage. But then, as you say, my original thought was, wow, just using chainmail would be a great funnel, for OD&D. Like, just take 10 troops and go out there and fight a battle, and whoever survives, almost like DCC. And then the more I started doing it, I was like, how much do we really even need? Do we need the ability scores? Do we need these things? They don't do much in OD&D, and I'm curious what Taylor's going to say about that. So that's where Unchained, which is the game we're working on now, is really based on, where you just play the hero level character, and it's more or less based almost solely on chainmail with very little OD&D.
Excellent. So rebuttal there.
That's interesting. It's interesting you mentioned the character abilities not doing very much. I support that, and that was one of the principles of design that Gygax believed in, and I believe he wrote about in the strategic review. That is, the abilities should matter in that you want to reward players who roll well. That's fun, but also the primary driver of a character's ability should be level. Why is that? Well, the primary driver of your survival is going to be the skill of the player, knowing to prod ahead, knowing to corner your enemies into a funnel so that you can take advantage of the environment to counteract their numbers. Being smart about how you play is going to make your character survive. As you survive, you gain more experience. As you gain more experience, you level. So by tying advancement and ability, then you reward the kind of game you want to create. Compared to, if I want to go entirely on chance, I'll play Yahtzee.
Right. Well, what's interesting about that is that's just true as a life thing. People love to level up. They like to get points. They like to do all these different things. And it's just a good psychological thing, right? Like, you could start with the best character ever, but if you never improve, it doesn't really feel like anything's happening. So I think having some kind of way of advancement in the game is key to making D&D super fun, really, versus let's say if you were just playing chainmail, with no advancement, which is why I do have a slight advancement system in my chainmail hack. Because I thought, if you just sit down and play chainmail every time, who cares if you're playing the same character? They never change, right? Mm-hmm. So you've got to have some form of advancement. Otherwise, I think the game doesn't work well for long campaigns, at least as a role-playing game. Maybe as a strategy game, it does, obviously.
Right. And yeah, as a strategy game, it absolutely would, because you have your map campaigns, you have your domain management aspects. So in the context of that, you're still talking about advancement, because your town grows, your dominion extends, and your army is changing over time. So you have that management, that resource management aspect, comparatively to the role-playing game, where it's more focused, it's more concise. You have the character advancing, where the army would and the domain would before. And conversely, that's one of the beauties of OD&D, and really most of the OSR editions that dip their toes into domain management. You have all of the above. At the first tier of the game, you have your character, their growth, their adventures. Then as you move up and you start moving across the map, the overland, you build a warband. You're still advancing as a character, but the advancement slows down dramatically. So the XP you need to get to the next level is significantly higher. And then once you get to the name level, some of those OSR games just stop. In OD&D, AD&D, both of them, I believe, have the caveat you can keep going at a predetermined linear rate once you get to a certain point, but the character, you get an extra hit point, essentially. And so at that point, you've transitioned into the domain game. So it's a combination of all of the above fitting into that paradigm.
Yeah, which is great. It kind of comes back to the idea that my overarching idea of everything, which is that, like, the game is not just one game. There's lots of things going on. There's different aspects of it. Your domain game is something completely different that you could totally play, like, with boards and minis and this and that. Whereas the role-playing game, you could play just theater of the mind and never write anything down and just kind of play out what the characters do and roll some dice here and there. I think it's really interesting how you can play so many different ways the same game, even the same characters.
I want to I don't want to cut you off,
Yeah.
Taylor, if you had an exact response to that.
Oh, no, you're good. I was going to talk about character abilities. So go ahead.
Oh,
cool.
well, let's hold that thought, and we'll come right back to that because Daniel mentioned something I want to hop into a little bit. Daniel, you've done some of these. You have some actual plays out there on YouTube where you guys have done some of this, and I know you've fiddled with this for a little while. Have you done Chainmail, just theater of the mind, and how has that worked for you, if you have?
Okay, so yes and no. 100% theater of the mind, no. But one of the first big battles that I had with my in-person group, who I'll start off by saying, people who don't follow myself and don't know, most of my in-person groups started as Pathfinder 1 players. So you're talking about players that came into the game, in a much different kind of system, and now we're playing OD&D. Our first large battle, I just took a piece of paper and I drew on the paper where various houses and stuff were. It said, where do you want to put your guys? And they kind of like drew, and we did almost like the football thing where you like draw lines. So it wasn't 100% theater of the mind because I wanted to give them some kind of a resource, but we didn't do measure inches, movement and stuff. And we did run it in Chainmail. They had 110 footmen and versus a bunch of basically pigmen that they were fighting and a giant pig. So yes and no. I mean, that's as close to as I've come. I think that when you start dealing with large numbers, it's and also I guess that's not 100% true. When I did my very first playtest, which you can hear on the podcast with Nikki, she does do a relatively large battle, and we do it 100% there to the mind. So but
that's actually what I was thinking of. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So that was actually, you do lose a little bit of the strategy there, and it just becomes rolling handfuls of dice. But that can also be really fun, So yeah, we have done that, but and now I'm thinking when Nikki ran it for us, she also ran a short campaign. We also had a big fight with orcs, and we did it completely in our heads. So you can do it. You lose a little bit of the strategy. You got to kind of, just like you do in any game when you theater of the mind, right? You've got to kind of be like, well, I move to them. Can I move to them versus the measuring with the stick and that kind of stuff.
And I know Taylor's using a VTT for what he's doing. And now, how much have you been able to play test your rules to actually a decent sized battle, Taylor?
So I wrote the Ringmail Medieval Battles PDF, which it's not for sale anywhere. It's just on a Google Drive that's linkable in the blog. I wrote that as a love letter to Chainmail when I was trying to figure out how to play, and it's undergone a couple revisions. How have I run it? Well, I have run it solo. My introduction to D&D as a hobby was via wargaming. So I went to a local hobby shop. I mentioned jokingly about TSR miniatures gathering dust. I was introduced to that hobby via Games Workshop. So they were playing a lot of Warhammer. They were playing a lot of Warhammer 40K and Mordheim. So when I went there, it was miniatures on the table. It was handcrafted terrain and dice and rulers. And or tape measures. We weren't absolute Luddites, but so for me, when I was trying to learn the system, I printed out some chits, and I can't show them on the podcast, but I can show you guys here different symbols. Now, these aren't original for a couple of years ago when I was playing, but I looked up, there were some symbols that are used by actual military strategists. I don't know if it's current edition, but so to speak, or if it was something that was used in Napoleonic era. But so you'd have the X for cavalry or the line for infantry, and you move things around the board. And so I ran with that idea and put them down on the table because we're not in a particularly big house. I've got too many small children running around to do a lot of painting, so I didn't have a lot of opportunity to do that. So just chits on the board, playing by myself. Alternative, I tried to run, I did set up a VTT system. One of the beauties of Foundry is the rapidity at which a technology developer, that is somebody who just writes code, will catch on to how to build those systems. And so I was able to put together a good VTT version in Foundry, which I can send the link out if you want to include that. If folks want to download it, it's again, it just you plug in the manifest file into your Foundry server and it'll run if folks want to give it a shot. But I haven't had a chance to run it very much on the VTT for a mass battle. But I've started a OD&D Chainmail home game, which I'm testing out stuff that I want to put into the role-playing version of my home game, Weapons, Wits, and Wizardry, which I started from the opposite end of where Daniel was coming from. Daniel had started with OD&D. I want to plug it into OD&D, and I'm being the rebellious type. Said, oh, no, I'm going to go from the ground up. I'm going to grab Chainmail. I'm going to read half of it, and then I'm going to start. And then humorously in interactions on Discord and call-ins back and forth on our relative podcasts, I saw some wisdom in what Daniel was talking about. I believe the exact advice or the exact commentary that you gave at the time was part of the reason you were having a smooth time building out the your Chainmail RPG was because you had gone through OD&D and because you had a grasp of the zen of the system. And so based on that zen, you were able to build it towards what you wanted it to be out of the framework that you had ingrained. So I kind of about-faced, said, okay, I'm going to run LBB as best I can, and then we'll work our way into Chainmail from there. And so we had our my third session should be on YouTube today. Actually, I've scheduled that to go out today as of time of recording, and we're going to run another game tonight. Hopefully, diving into a sunken temple.
Oh, so nice. That's the brass ziggurat.
Yep, 3 sessions of Brass Ziggurat so far, and so we're going to have another episode of Brass Ziggurat drop in about 20 minutes.
Oh, very cool. I got to go in about 20 minutes, guys.
Okay. Yep. Understood. I don't blame you. That's much more important than this talk. But that's folks, for those listening, this is a recorded conversation. It's already, by the time you hear this, it's already up on YouTube. You can go see it already. There'll be links to everything we're talking about in the show notes, by the way. Yeah, no, it's very interesting how you guys kind of came at it this different ways. But Taylor, I cut you off. You had an idea you want to express on ability scores.
Well, yeah, thinking about ability scores, there's a good segue here because one of the things that has come up immediately in the OD&D game is there are no thieves. Thieves did not exist until Greyhawk. So how do you handle thiefy stuff? And I know Daniel has a great resource on that. I won't steal his thunder if he wants to speak to it. That he's got a link that I remember I downloaded and looked at from your share drive from the Bandit's Key podcast. And what I've been doing lately is a different approach. I'm rolling a dice pool, roll under. So you can roll 1, 2, 3, or 5 6-sided dice. If it's under the relevant ability, then you succeed. Why do that? Well, because you have a definitive curve in a dice pool. And on 3d6, it's average 10 or 11. So an average character will succeed about half the time. But then when you have the 4 or 5d6, that pushes it up to like 14, 15. So a character with exceptional stats will succeed, half the time. Whereas a character with marginal stats is very, you're looking at, you need to get lucky. And so the appeal to that for me, this doubles back to the design principle, level versus ability. So for me, I want your abilities to matter, but I also don't want them to be the end all be all. So the solution I think I'm going to start playing with is allowing purchase of thief dice. So if you're doing a thiefy thing, you can roll an extra die in that pool and pick the lower ones to go under your ability. I'm still working out the exact probabilities on that, trying to keep it compatible with OSR, TSR, fidelity kind of systems, so that way you can plug and play. That's one of the things that when I first came into the movement, I was playing a lot of Dungeon Crawl Classics. I was playing a lot of the newer kind of indie games. And one of the things that you notice if you write a game from scratch, and this will tie back to ability scores eventually, but one of the things that you have to do is you have to rewrite everything. So I've since tried to keep my home brews and my home campaigns kind of close to the source. So I do want to deviate. It is a framework where you do want to amend the way that the system works so as to produce the desired experience and narrative you want to support. But at the same time, the closer you are, the more benefit you get. There's 50 solid years of user content that you can draw on. And there's dozens of monster books, hundreds of adventures, just infinite, logarithmically an infinite supply of material that you can plug and play with relative ease when you maintain that sort of mechanical eye on what you're doing. So that, to speak to the ability scores in the Little Brown Books, you have 6 attributes and you have 3 classes. And so we note of the 3 abilities that have game impact, that's dexterity, which that will affect your to hit in the original books. I believe that was the only thing dexterity did for you. I think the armor class
missiles,
yeah, it was a missile attacks. Yep. And Constitution, you had your system shock and you had your hit points. And then you had charisma, which arguably was the best stat because it affected your ability for retainers. And so then you have strength, intelligence, and wisdom. They don't on paper do anything. But then this ties back to level and advancement. Your strength as a fighting man is going to drive how quickly you level. Your intelligence as a magic user is going to drive how quickly you level. Wisdom for clerics. So why do those abilities not do anything? I'll do some air quotes, make sure everybody fits in. And those abilities are your advancement. So arguably those abilities are going to be the ones that, based on your class choice, are going to drive your character's competence. They're going to be the primary. That's why they call them the prime requisite. You need those if you're going to advance more rapidly. They're extremely valuable to those classes.
Yeah, what I think is interesting about that is that I sometimes see people, let's say, coming into OSE now, and they question the abilities, the prime requisite boost to XP, and then usually what they'll say is, why does strength give a fighter a bonus to their XP when it's already so useful for attacks, right? Because they're coming from a modern D&D where they think of the bonus being the main thing, whereas right in OD&D, that's not really what it is. It's really about leveling up faster, which, and by the way, I've heard people say, oh, it doesn't make a difference. At being 20 some odd sessions into an OD&D campaign, it makes a difference. One of the characters is a -5, 2 of them are +10, and one's at 0, and you can definitely see a noted difference in the increase over time.
Oh yeah, 10% you absolutely can. You absolutely can. I'm like I said, I'm 4 sessions into the Ash Coast, and we have a character who has a -20%, and so he's definitely going to level a little bit slower. Coincidentally, that's the same player who's asking about thieves.
Because they have the low. So on the dice pool thing, I think it's interesting because I'm also doing a similar thing with ability scores and dice pools. I think dice pools are a great option for all the reasons why you pointed out. I use them mostly for things like, okay, you're in this ancient temple, you're trying to figure something out. Well, the cleric would have a chance of knowing something here, so roll this much under your prime requisite score. The fighter, would I know how to use exotic weapons? Or
you're breaking up, Daniel.
I've lost on. You broke up just a little bit there.
Yeah, well, you were talking about the fighter.
You're back.
Or maybe the fighter. Do you know how to use this catapult or this thing that you may not have seen before, exotic weapon of war? Or in games like I like to run, like some kind of weird laser pistol, right? Like, can you figure it out? Magic user, can I interpret these texts without using a read language spell or that kind of stuff? This kind of thing is what I use them for, and I do the exact same thing with the dice pools. And I usually base them on how difficult the task is, and sometimes the level. Like I'll say, well, you're a 3rd level magic user. You've probably heard of these things. And I definitely use that a lot. The thief skill thing that you mentioned, I was trying to base it around gear, which works pretty well. Although, interestingly enough, my players have hardly bought any of that gear. They just, I don't know why. It's out there for them, but so I don't know if that's successful or not. But what I was thinking was your thief point thing reminded me of a game. It's called Adventure Fantasy Game, I'm pretty sure. And I'm trying to think of who made it, but I think Paulo Greco. But he has a system called 6 Up or something like that. And what he does is, as you succeed in something, you spell out the word expert. I think so. The first time you do it, you put an E and then you put an X and then whatever. And then once you reach that many successes, then you get a bonus. So it's not so much that they buy it, they have to buy it by doing it. So if I climb a lot of walls and I succeed by however means you're going to have them do it, eventually I become an expert in that, and then I get an extra die when I do it. That's kind of how he does it. So you got to actually do it in play, which I thought was kind of a clever system. The game is definitely called Adventure Fantasy Game. I'm sorry, I do not remember the author. I'm pretty sure it's Paulo Greco, but it could be.
No, yeah. So it I'll put a link in the show notes.
Jason has pulled his print copy out.
Yeah,
Nice.
I've got it uses it's got a mechanic in there, 5 more.
5 more, that's what it is.
Yeah. There'll be a link in the show notes, folks.
Because the actual mechanic is when you try something, you have to roll a 5 or better to succeed. That's how he does it. So, but you could do it however you do it. You could do it with ability scores or whatever. And then you spell out this word. And then once you get the word spelled out, then you gain that skill effectively and you get a bonus. But I think that's kind of a clever way to do it. And I was considering incorporating something like that in my game eventually. But I've honestly found that it's weird. Without thieves, people just don't even bother trying to pick locks and stuff. They just tell me how they want to do it. I'll use a crowbar. I'll, take my axe to the lock. I just don't, if the door's locked, can I smash it down? They don't really, they've lost that. And initially they were like, no thief, what do we do? But then they were just like, well, no thief. So,
yep. I've noticed the same thing. Yeah. One of the things that included in the dungeon that have run so far are keys. So certain enemies will have keys to certain doors, and some enemies will random drop them. Like they may just happen to have one, and so the characters have found a couple of these keys, and they're kind of coveted. They're like, okay, let's try this. We'll use this, and so they're exactly like you said. They're thinking, how do we get through? Think outside the box to get, or maybe even just go around, find a different way through.
Right.
No, I think that's great, and I'm not a big fan of the thief class, to be honest, because I think that one of the issues I've had with thieves in later editions, and we won't go into this on this show, but the idea that because a thief can do it, it keeps the other characters from doing it, to do that niche protection. And then, anybody, which isn't totally true. I mean, really anybody can listen to a door, or anybody can, try to hide in shadows, but you have some GMs or DMs that'll try to do that literally. Well, no, you're a thief. You can't move silently. Well, sure, you should have a chance, but you're not going to be as good as they are, because that's what they do, right?
It's funny you say that, because I guess I will out myself as being a thief. The thief is my favorite class. I love thieves. It's absolutely my favorite class. And it's funny I don't have thieves in my game, but that's because, going back to what Taylor was saying, I'm trying to stay as close to the source material as possible to see. I tried to saddle myself to the bus to see like what I can do with this. Like if it was 1974 or whatever it was, and I had this game, how would I handle it when somebody wants to do this thing? Because there was no thief, right? And maybe the answer is to make a thief class, which is basically what they ended up doing. But I find that playing without all these extra classes adds something. It doesn't take it away. It's weird. That being said, I wouldn't take a thief out of the BX game, but in this game, I don't see the reason to add it. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I'm going to interrupt a little bit too, and just say it expands player horizons. When they know that a thief can do X, then they go, okay, we need to get a thief to do X. And when that option isn't available, then when the option isn't on the character sheet, then they think in the game. And so that opens a lot of avenues. So
yeah, even to the idea of like, well, we're going to take this treasure chest and lug it back to town unopened because there's a locksmith there or a blacksmith that can open it for us. Again, there are ways beyond this moment. And I think that sometimes people think that way because a lot of adventures, unfortunately, I think are designed that way without a campaign in mind, where it's like, we have to do it now. We're in this dungeon. But the idea of leaving and coming back is very much part of the OD&D process. It's like you come to a door, you can't get through it. Well, we'll try to get through it another time. We'll come back with something else. We'll go another way. Having these like single choice options, which, sorry, I'm going to throw shade at the 5-room dungeon, which has become so popular, which again is a cool technique for one shots, but having that be your baseline creates these systems where people think like, oh, these are the scenes that we need to have. And it creates a game where the players don't necessarily think that they should leave or try something different because the GM has planned for them to do this thing. And sometimes I just tell my players, I mean, I'll just be like, you cannot get through this right now with what you're suggesting. If you want to come back, go for it. But there's 3 other hallways, and I'll just tell them that, because sometimes they forget, they get locked into it,
Oh yeah, that's come up in my home games before. Absolutely. Because stuff like water hazards, I like putting water in dungeons because players hate it. But yet I've had
do you go like this though? Do you go, oh, you gotta take your armor off?
That's another fun thing about chainmail, but we'll get into that. And so yeah, but water. Do they want to take the armor off to make it through? Do they have a boat? Do they wade through it? Do they work around? And do they go? Another fun thing is submerged passages. So do they jump in and then go through the tunnel to get to the next airspace? That's always a fun one.
Yeah, very much a Poseidon adventure. Right?
Yeah.
Exactly. So speaking of, you mentioned taking your armor off, and we'll get back to that in chainmail. Well, let's not keep our listeners in suspense. Why don't we hit that now?
Yeah, taking the armor off. One of the primary things for me with chainmail is I loved the idea of some monsters you can't beat unless you're a hero. I loved the idea that Smaug was invincible except because Bard had a special arrow and Bard was a special hero. And I like the idea that heroes and superheroes require simultaneous hits to take them out of action. So Conan standing against the tide of Zothasil, I think his forces, before he's, paralyzed and taken to the dungeon beneath, oh Lord, I forget the name of the town. I feel like embarrassed now. We'll have to edit that in later. But it's out of one of the early stories. That's great because you have to, you one-on-one, you can't beat him, but you need a group of guys to kind of pile on. And or in that case, you need a sorcerer to use a trick to get him to go down. And I love that about chainmail for 2 reasons. One, it creates that narrative leap, that sort of delineation between what is epic play and what is mundane. But then at the same time, it also provides an abstraction of character skill when it comes to self-defense. So in the traditional game, you have hit points, and there's always an argument about what is hit points. Is it meat points? Is it dodge points? Is it luck points? Is it a combination of all of the above? And usually it's a combination of all the above. But the point is the argument is constant. It doesn't matter how many times you agree about what a hit point is. There's always an argument about what it represents. And so the idea of the hero taking 4 concurrent hits to take down, that makes sense to me because the hero is good at defending himself. You need to have if you have 2 or 3 guys coming up against him, they need to have the right weapons to combat him, or you need to have 8 or 10 guys to be able to hit him at the same time because he's able to dodge those blows, because he's able to ward off those attacks. And that spoke to me better about character defense than did a luck or a skill influence on hit points. And that's in part one of the directions I'm trying to go with man-to-man combat. In the episode of Ash Coast that's going live as of this recording, we have doxed hit points. They're gone. No more hit points. And we're doing concurrent hits. And that did 2 big things. One, it made combats go a lot faster. Man-to-man can be, a lot of people think it's clunky, but once you get the initiative system, and if you're looking at the weapon chart, it's really not that slow. The initiative system, you get a couple key points that you have in mind, and then it's just 2d6 back and forth, and you can position yourselves and move around. But so it was actually still pretty fast. It was you eliminated a roll for the hit point damage, and so that's by necessity it's a little quicker. But then 2, you have it made certain monsters a lot scarier. And so also I can hear I have a little bit of child noise in the background. Let me know if that's coming across on my microphone too aggressively, and I'll stop talking for a bit and mute myself. But
that's fine. You're fine.
We'll invite one of the twins in, and he can tell you about lawnmowers or garbage trucks or something. That's pertinent. That's everyone's favorite segment in my podcast anyway, is when the toddlers show up. But yeah, and so to conclude on that, certain monsters become a lot scarier when you have to hit them twice in order to take them down. And that is not something that is in Chainmail. That is something that I'm trying out. So most of the Chainmail monsters with multiple hit dice require cumulative hits. So you have that hit point concept. So you have a giant. If you hit the giant, you're supposed to record it. And once it's been hit 12 times, he's out of action. But well, that's proto hit points going by hit dice, which I think, Daniel, was something that you had approached in at least one of your actual plays. But yeah, so concurrent hits, that was one of the things for me that I liked because it represented a good representation, a good smooth I don't want to say abstraction again, but I'm going to. To represent a character defending themselves and the skill of defense scaling with their martial prowess.
Mm-hmm.
Right. No, I agree. That's why I kind of go back and forth. So in the Unchained version, where I'm the heroes, basically I'm not using OD&D at all, I do exactly that. I have no hit points at all. But I find the hit points are good in the OD&D version because they give the characters two different things to work with. I never use them I never use them for monsters, so only for characters. Hit points are very specifically a character feature. And I use them for things like falling in pits, poison damage, all that type of stuff. That's basically where I use my hit points there. I do find that the concurrent hits work really well, especially at higher levels. One of the things I was afraid of was, and it started to happen, there was like that weird mid-level thing where they got to like 4th level and they were so strong that nothing could take them out, especially when most of the enemies would eventually be worn down, right? So you have like a giant, like Taylor mentioned, it takes 12 hits, but not all at once. But the player characters take 4 hits to take them down, let's say. It's so hard for a character to go down. Now, granted, they just go down when they go down, so that's a bit dangerous. But what ends up happening is you start throwing a few other monsters in there, like let's say a troll, and you go, well, a troll, to represent their regeneration, you've got to hit them 6 times in the same round. Otherwise, they just regenerate back. And now all of a sudden, that troll is way tougher than a giant because of that. And I think that's a really good point that Taylor's making there. In a way, hit points. The other thing too is I find hit points to be less exciting. It becomes like counting arrows, and I like counting arrows, but in a sense, because you go into a dungeon and you're getting worn down, and eventually you turn around and leave. But that doesn't generally represent a lot of the fiction that I like. I was just watching a really terrible ninja movie last night or night before. And, the guy, typical ninja movie, right? It's like he's going through, he's getting beat up. He's like practically dead. He's in the whole thing. But then when he gets in that final fight with the bad guy, he's full strength again. I mean, he looks like it anyways, right? He does all of his skills. He takes out this bad guy that nobody else could beat. It's like if that was a D&D game, that would not have been the case unless you had a bunch of healing, which I think is interesting. I think the game is fascinating because the different ways that people have approached things, right? Like we see in the OSR sphere, people do, when going back to what Taylor was talking about, where they don't really know how to define hit points. So then you start having like meat points versus luck points versus whatever. Then you're tracking multiple things. That's one solution, right? The other solution is to have really rapid healing or abundant healing. Mm-hmm. But I find the hit dice just works better. You don't have to change anything. The characters just are always heroes until they're not, right? Until they finally get whacked and they're down.
Right. And the other thing it does is it knocks down that invincibility, like, well, I don't have to worry about that. I've got so many hit points. I can just ignore these, or not ignore, but it keeps that feeling mortality in there. Because even if you're a superhero, there's a chance you can get one-shotted, right? So
that's right. Any creature that can kill you, right? There's some creatures that just can't, right? Like a single guard is not going to take Conan out unless maybe he has a 2-handed sword. Even then he couldn't, right? Because I don't think that wouldn't armored foot against even if Conan was in a loincloth, like one guard with a 2-handed sword cannot take Conan out. It's impossible. But then that creates great narrative because you don't have to worry about even having that fight. You just, like, one guard steps in front of you with the 2-handed sword. Fine, I'm a hero. I snap his neck and I take his sword. Like, that's it, right? You don't need to go through a whole process and it actually makes, because I've noticed too that a lot of people like a more narrative game. Like one of the biggest complaints about, let's say, random encounters and stuff is that they're boring and they don't have anything to do with the story. But the thing is that they're there for a reason, right? They're a hit point train, they're a resource train. But if you don't have hit points, you don't have to insert those. So it allows you to play a game that's more narrative. I'm not saying you should never random encounters, but I'm saying that they don't become necessary anymore. You can just make every encounter really important or just narrate past them. Again, the two guards standing there, I smash their heads together. It's like, it doesn't matter. Those guards can't beat you anyway. So why are we playing this out? Just tell me how you killed them and we're done. Maybe you roll initiative to see if they call for help first, depending on the situation. But otherwise, it really does allow for much more narration, which I really like.
Right. And there's no reason to waste that 15 minutes of combat to take out those two guards, especially these days when we're all playing online and you only have a 2-3 hour session. Why waste a big, a sizable hunk of that session to a combat that, and I realize it's a controversial statement to say a combat doesn't matter, but ultimately in the scheme of what we're doing, getting past those two guards shouldn't be that big of a deal. Although it can be interesting if you fail, but.
Right. And talking about combats that don't matter, to phrase it a little differently, even if you are playing a dedicated combat skirmish game. So say we've got 4th edition at the table. I know a couple folks in our podcast ecosystem enjoy 4th edition. If I am going to engage a game that's dedicated to combat or the combat is a major driver for, why am I going to do the boring one? So if it's my 5 party members versus 2 guards who don't stand a chance, or if we're talking about 1 hero against 2 guards who don't stand a chance, that's not interesting. That doesn't engage the mechanics. That doesn't engage the purpose of the game. So even if you're coming at it from the perspective of creating that shared narrative, then absolutely, they can't beat you. There's no point. But then if you're coming at it from the gamist perspective of, I want to play a skirmish game, you're going to roll like 2 attacks and they're going to go down because they're mooks, they're minions. And so why would you do that when you could move on to the set piece?
Right.
Definitely. And I think that brings up a point I definitely want to hit on in this podcast, that in case because we probably have listeners here that haven't watched any of your actual plays, they haven't read Chainmail, so they're not real familiar with it, and they're hanging on just because of the melodious sounds of your voices. But one of the thing that I find fascinating with Chainmail, and the thing that really draws me to it, are the 3 modes of combat, because in the scaling that allows. And I don't know, I know Daniel's played with that quite a bit in his. I don't know if Taylor, you want to tackle that, or you want Daniel to tackle that?
Yep. In terms of play, I've played mass battles. I have used the fantasy rules. I'm currently working through War Game Culture. Had a series. I interviewed the fellow Stephen behind War Game Culture a while back on my podcast, where he was producing a War Games scenario campaign. And so I'm using the Chainmail fantasy rules to play through that. But I have not had a mass combat involving players yet. So I can definitely, I've used the different modes of combat, but I've not used them all in an RPG context. So I would definitely have to defer to Dungeon Master Daniel.
Excellent. Daniel, because to me, this is one of the biggest strengths of why we want to use Chainmail, right? These 3 modes of combat.
Right. Yeah. And I think that that was really the draw to me, right? Like what I said, when I read Jason Bay's stuff, I was like, this is really interesting. And I've used all 3. I find I use man-to-man the least because of the type of games I'm currently running. I'll just quickly go over them because maybe people have in what I call man-to-man combat, or it's called man-to-man combat in Chainmail. Effectively, your weapons and armor matter, right? Each blow matters. So a hero being 4 hit die would get 4 blows, and you might parry depending on your weapons. Like all that matters. So that's the kind of combat where like you have a sword out and the guy approaches you in plate mail, you switch to a mace because it'll be better at hitting them, right? That's it. And the way I do it was I use hit points for that combat, just for that combat, and hit points go back really slow in my game. Then the most common type of combat, which I call troop combat, which I think is also called troop combat, is when you've got multiple opponents, like lots of them, 3-to-1 type scale, or you're fighting people who don't have armor and stuff like monsters, right? So you're fighting like a giant snake. I use it for that. And effectively in those, your weapons and armor still matter, but they're more abstracted. So a mace and a sword are both heavy foot, so they're the same against that thing. Those combats are much faster. It's really everybody's just throwing a number of 6-siders looking for 5s and 6s. So that stuff can be super fast around the table. And then that's also used for your larger combats, like hundreds of opponents. You could use it for that. And then finally, there's the fantasy combat, which is the way I play it. Anyways, it's abstracted. Weapons don't matter at all. It's literally one type of heroic character against another. So a hero fighting a giant would use this combat, and then weapons and stuff don't matter at all. You can narrate however you like. And I find that each one works really well. Unfortunately, you can't really use fantasy combat until you get up to higher levels because nobody's a hero, right? So that sits in the background in the campaign. And early on, you're using a lot, at least for me, because I was fighting a lot of like giant spiders and stuff. I'm using a lot of the troop combat, if you will, the more abstracted. But I've used also jousting, which is in Chainmail, which is awesome, which is amazing, by the way.
That I have not used.
Oh, it's so good. Whenever one of my favorite things at my table is, because like I say, I play with a lot of players who came from like Pathfinder and 5e and stuff. When I bust out something weird like that, like when I bust out outdoor survival, and like my player E was like, "Are you tricking us into playing board games?" yes, I am. But yeah, but these modes of combat change the way things feel. So again, you've got a party of 5 adventurers against 30 orcs. You can do a troop combat and it's real fast, right? It's fast, but it's also furious. Everybody's just rolling their dice. You can have everybody roll at once. All the melees happen simultaneous. But then, like for instance, the campaign I played in, we had one of our characters do a man-to-man combat against an orc chieftain in order to win over those orcs, because we had a small orc band that we were controlling, because that's what we do. And then there was like a bigger orc band, and we knew we would lose. So one of our characters challenged them for the leadership, and they did a man-to-man combat, and it was like a back and forth, and it was really dramatic. And then we fought a demon at the end, and we used fantasy combat for that. So I think having the different types of play really just changes the game. It's not always just like, my character does these 3 moves every single combat, and they use hit points, and the cleric does a healing word, and the warlock does a eldritch blast, and the fighter does his extra move or whatever. It really does feel different when you're playing with different systems, and I think that's a huge strength of using the chainmail system, which some people don't use, right? Some people just pick one of them and focus on it. I think using all 3 really is key for me. Also, I should add that when I was at Gen Con, I ran OD&D with Chainmail, and then I painted a bunch of 2mm miniatures, and they did the dungeon portion of it. And then when they came out, we took a 10-minute break, and I set up a battle on the table, and they fought with miniatures, and we did an actual Chainmail miniatures battle, and it was pretty awesome. I mean, it was really fun. Oh, it was so cool.
So jealous.
And they were all like, "Oh my god, it was so fun." to give them elementals, and it was really funny because they thought they had it. And I just they're like, "You go first." I was like, and I moved all the wizards' men and stuff. They're like, "Oh crap!"
Beautiful.
It was so good. And 2 of the guys were like ex-military, and they're like getting down and getting all these strategies. It was so fun. It was just so fun getting like into this whole like world of using a different kind of combat. And nobody was like, "Oh, but my character, and I have this on my character sheet," because they switched modes, right? And that's great. And I think that's a really positive thing. I don't mean to say that you shouldn't think about your character, but like in those modes, you can actually come out and play almost a different game while you're playing the same game, which to me is just really, really powerful and interesting.
Yeah, but it really speaks to the strength of the genre. And I think either I called Ray Otis or Ray Otis called me. I forget which one it was, but I think the conversation went the same way. It's the game presents so many avenues to appreciate it that may be one of the primary reasons that the genre, the fantasy, adventure, and role-playing genre, makes its way into the hearts and minds of so many people, because there's so many different aspects of play and of experience that you can do with that kind of a game.
Yeah. I do wish I played more man-to-man. That's the one thing that I feel like doesn't happen as much in my table, because it does feel, probably because we don't use it as much, it does feel a little bit more slow, especially compared to the troop combat. But I think part of that is just they're just not playing it as much, because you've got to keep track of more specifically their armor. If I just say orcs are heavy foot, everybody knows they can look on their chart and go, heavy foot, I need 5 dice, they equal this, whatever, they just roll.
Yep.
4 kills, done. Whereas if I say, well, this orc's in chainmail, that one's in plate, this one has a shield,
it varies, yeah.
Yeah, and it's not as slow as you think, though, as I thought it would be, because a lot of the monsters they're fighting, especially in those circumstances, are fewer hit dice. So they die in 1 or 2 hits anyway, so it's not like it's a big deal. But at first, it really intimidated me, but we've been using it more. So we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I was brought into the Seven Voyages of Zarlarthan.
Oh, very cool.
And I was brought into that by a friend, and that game has a D20 translation of the man-to-man table based on armor class in it.
Okay.
And so that is something that's very interesting. I may have to pick up a copy of that and take a look, but that would allow you to turn man-to-man into a dice pool in that regard and try to overcome it that way. Granted, it's a pool of D20s, and it makes sense to go with D6 in 1974 because how many people have 50 D20s in 1974? But I'm looking over, I can probably go grab a bag of 5 or 6 D20s right now, just sitting on my desk behind me. So interesting idea. I haven't tried it myself.
What do you think the advantage there is? More granularity?
The advantage of the man-to-man combat.
Well, D20 versus D6. I guess.
Right. And that'll be sentence number 2. I promise I won't wander on this one. But the advantage of man-to-man is the granularity of weapon versus armor. And you give the fighter a whole bunch of toys to play with, a whole bunch of tools in their toolkit, which in a more abstracted system, so our BXs of the world, then they don't have a reason to carry multiple weapons. I have my sword, I have my bow, I'm done. But even like AD&D, you have a motive because you have the weapons versus armor table out of the DMG. Okay, I'm going to bring my hammer because we might come up against skeletons. I'm going to bring my sword because of the advanced damage. So in Chainmail, that's implicit. There's the fighter has a reason to bring that out. So why D20 versus 2D6? Personally, I'm thinking expedience, because if I have 4 or 5 attacks and I'm rolling, I fight as 4 or 5 men, and we have the troop combat, that's very easy. So I'm fighting as 5 men. I'm armed as medium. My opponent is heavy. My opponent is heavy. So I'm just going to roll 5 dice and I'm looking for 6s. Very, very fast, very easy. With man-to-man, if you give them multiple attacks according to their fights as equivalents, then you have to roll 2d6 5 consecutive times. And so that's going to take a lot more time. And so that's something I'm having to think about as we're playing. And so one solution is what we're adopting in the Ash Coast right now is to tie the attack to the hit dice of the opponent. So if I fight as 5 men and I'm attacking a zombie with 2 hit dice, I may only attack it 3 times because multiple, and it's not as complicated as it sounds when you use subtraction instead of division with modulus remainder. But where I was going with that is the D20 is faster. So I can either do that long division and roll fewer times, or I can pick up multiple D20 and it rolls the same as the troop combat. So you have a handful of dice, you look for successes, and you go. So why do D20 instead of 2D6? Dice pool and counting successes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
The
way I do it.
Run out of go. No, go, Daniel. Go.
Well, just the way I do it is because obviously that happens more often as the game master because you're rolling multiple bad guys. I have like 7 different sets of 2d6 that are different colors. And they just know, like the blue one is always against E's character, the red one's always against Henry's character. And I just throw them all on the table and I'm like, but yeah, I could totally see the D20s doing the same thing, but even easier. Yeah. You just don't get that range, right? What do you call it? The middle.
The curve.
Yeah,
the curve.
You don't get the curve.
The key there, and that's one of the appendices in the Ringmail medieval battles that I mentioned earlier. That was one of the first things I did was I looked at the distribution. So I think a difficulty or target number of 7. So you have your Morning Star versus a lightly armored character with a shield that requires a 7. So you have a 60. I think it's a 60% chance to hit. Because 7 there are the most number of 7 is the most commonly rolled number on 2d6. So if you need that or above, you have a slightly better than even chance. So it's about 40%. So you compare that to a d20 that's linear for 1 through 25% each step. If you have a 60% chance to succeed, that's DC 12. So what you do is you do the set where you see 7, you substitute 12.
Gotcha.
And when and that I think is the innovation that was interesting for me with 7 Voyages, is because that's what they did. They figured out that kind of difference. Now that changes the modifiers a little bit. So on 2d6, we'll fast forward a year or two on the OD&D's timeline. You have Greyhawk. Greyhawk adds more functionality. Greyhawk adds the apply your strength modifier to hit. Greyhawk adds apply, for fighters. And I believe that adds the wisdom modifier to your save versus spells. I believe. I
don't use that new school stuff, so I don't.
But so on 2d6, the biggest reason you wouldn't add that +1 is because the system starts to groan. So if I have a magic sword and it's +1 or +3 versus magic users. So if I've got a +3 bonus, that 7 that I needed to hit, or really magic users are going to be wearing robes. So that Morning Star only needs a 6 to hit. I'm rolling a 3 or better on 2d6. In order to fail, I have to roll Snake Eyes. That's a 2% chance of failure. That's literally half as likely as a natural 1. So when you have a 2d6 distribution, the bonuses and penalties, they swing really quickly. And you have the system can't handle modifiers that are great. Well, it can't. It obviously does handle them because you're rolling dice and adding numbers, but the probability goes way out of whack when you have those bigger modifiers. And so that might have been part of the reason behind having fewer modifiers in that regard. And a +1 sword on 2d6, that's a huge benefit. On a D20, it's 5%. Similarly, that's why you can add your strength modifier, no problem. I have my +3 sword. I have +2 for my strength modifier. That's +5. That's pretty handy. That's pretty good. But you're up to +5. That is still less of a bonus than that +3 sword was in the 2d6 curve. And so that is absolutely something to think about. How does the linear distribution of modifiers affect the and here I am. I'm interrupting our focus on narrative and moving our character arcs forward, and I'm talking about nuts and bolts of linear algebra.
Yeah.
But this is what people are tuned in for.
And also, what I really like about that is that approach. And my general thought on that is, hell yeah, you have a +3 sword versus a magic user, you should hit him every time. And if that magic user is not a wizard, and if he's a wizard, he's going to fight on the even a seer can fight on the fantasy chart. Right. So where the +3 still makes a big difference. But now hero versus seer, to me, like that sword should be an epic weapon that can cut down. And that is really one thing that I had to really get my head around, was that a lot of people that play in the OSR, that play these older games, think of their character, especially the OSR. I don't feel like old school, but OSR, feel like their characters are these like guys in the mud, kind of just hacking their way through and not surviving every time. But when you play OD&D with Chainmail, your characters are heroes once they reach like 3rd level. Like they are true heroes. Like my players cut through. I had to fight with 4 of them, beat 12 ogres. I mean, yeah. I mean, they didn't have a magic staff and everything, but still, like they are badass. And if you don't like that way of playing, then you might not want to do it the way I do it. Because man, what I realized right away was, you talk about people talking about 5e or Pathfinder being superheroes. Oh no, these guys are, 4th level fighter wading into like even 10 or 12 guards. The chance of them going down if they have armor on is so small. You are epic. So yeah,
it's really not.
Ready for it.
That's awesome, because humorously, I before we had started recording, I mentioned that I was very grateful, Jason, for you to set this up, because I'd been meaning to touch base with Daniel and try to do a tandem episode, and then we got to do this, and essentially Jason was our liaison. I didn't have to schedule anything at all. We just get to talk about it, and the tentative title for that conversation was going to be a Jason catchphrase, that is the pathetic aesthetic. And that's a phrase, and I know that I've heard it on Nerds Variety Cast. I know I've heard it here, where just like you said, a lot of OSR games are kind of focused on the grind, or focused on the lower level, and Chainmail totally rips that out of the water. OD&D totally rips that out of the water. For now, there is the grind phase, there is the wallowing in the mud phase, and that's level 1, level 2. But once you hit that hero status, you're in a whole different world, and you can still get smeared. So talking about fantasy combat, a hero going up against a troll, you have a chance to get them, but they have a chance to one-shot you. So there's still that chance, but the scale is different. And all of a sudden, the bandits that are accosting you on the road, they better get back to their keep, because you're an OD&D lower, you're a name level OD&D fighter. You're not going to take any of this. And so one of the very fun things about OD&D and with Chainmail that you've illustrated more eloquently than I'm going to, but one of the very fun things is you progress out of the pathetic aesthetic and into epic fantasy, and you can do that whole range from basic to immortal within the little brown books.
Yeah, 100%. I right, exactly. That's true. Like when my campaign started, there's only one character that was at the beginning. Like everybody who's playing lost characters in the beginning when they were first and second level. But then again, like I said, once you get to like third level, and you're careful, because I also added I don't know if you're using this or not, but I added the rule where you can defend people, and you get like a fighter in plate mail that's 4 hit die, right? And he says, I just stand in front of the magic user and defend them against these bandits. Now the magic user is also more or less protected, right? Yes, the fighter's taking more blows, but theoretically they're going to survive it, hopefully, although it didn't always work out for one of our guys. But yeah, it's like, and they actually do that thing that every RPG talks about, protect the magic user. But then when you play in games, everybody's just like, well, the magic user stands in the back, and they're just like, well, all right, the goblins shoot them with their bow and they're dead. But it's like, no, the magic user stays behind the fighter who defends them, and it really does create that more epic fantasy. But it took a few times. Like I said, they ran into a 6-hit die monster when they were second level, and like 3 of them died in like 2 rounds. And then the one remaining player was like, I run.
Oh, absolutely. That came up in the Brass Ziggurat game recently. They ran into a room of zombies, and it was just this kind of storage closet, almost like your hall closet. You've heard of skeletons in the closet. This was zombies in the closet, but
that's where you store your zombies.
Yeah, that's where we keep them. Keeps the smell down. But so they open the door, and they had a great plan up front. They formed up into a line outside the door, and to try to limit the numbers. So there were more undead trying to come out of their zombie locker than there were PCs, but they were funneling them into, they're essentially doing what you said. They said, okay, however we need to form up here, the magic users got in the back, and then the armored guys got up in the front, and then kind of positioned themselves in a cone, so that when the undead came out, they could just pummel them and prevent them from kind of swarming and overwhelming. And that little bit of a spoiler, it didn't go quite as intended, but while they were retreating, one of the fighters had a great epic moment where he's like, he's going to hold the entire the hallway against them. And so the party retreats, and one of the fighters kind of shows down against this horde of advancing monsters. So it's great, awesome. Great opportunity. Yeah, it was a lot of fun to play, and I hope my players are having as much fun as I am, because I want them to keep coming back. And it's a great, even at the low levels, you have those opportunities to. And the reason I bring it up, you mentioned like a level 2 party getting beaten up by a level 6 monster. That's absolutely an opportunity for heroism, these very interesting scenes to play out. And then that changes. You're a fighter who ran away, he can come back for revenge, and then now the shoe is on the other foot. And then you have another opportunity as you go forward for these same kind of moments of heroism in increasingly epic surroundings, increasingly interesting and diverse environments and dungeons or maps. Or so I start the game running from the Balrog through cramped hallways and mines, and then I end the game smiting him against the mountaintop, against the endless stair.
100%, and I think that plays out really well. Like in one other circumstance, they got ambushed by 1-hit die monsters, but there was a lot of them. And again, they lost 2 PCs, and the other 2 ran. They went back to town with the gold they had. They knew there was more treasure down there. They enticed more people. We got 2 new PCs, of course. They got like 6 henchmen and just went down there with spears, set up a plan and just took out the thing like that, because they went in with the strategy, and of course they lost some of the henchmen and stuff, but in the end it worked out for them because they had to go back and fight it. And it really changes the way, kind of like I was saying earlier, like the expectation of just being able to walk through the dungeon and everything's going to die for you if you fight it is been taken away, especially at these early levels, with just like a regular OSR game. So it's not like they're superheroes in the beginning. And again, they could still die. Like the thing they just went through, there was multiple times where, in fact, one of the guys did like twice. 2 people have gone down, but I have the rule that Cure Light Wounds brings you back up if you do it right away. So basically 2 people did actually die and they're on 4th level. So it's not like impossible by any means.
Yep, absolutely. So to double back on the a little bit on the man-to-man that I talked about with long division, it actually does not involve a lot of long division. I just said that for comedic effect. But so what we are actively doing, and I have a blog post that I wrote on this yesterday, so it's fresh in my mind. That'll publish eventually. But so what we're doing there is trying to take why I'm doubling back, this ties in because what you're talking about, you have the 6-hit die monster coming in against a group of spearmen, and now you have 6 attacks going in. You have a much better chance of damaging it, taking it down. You have your strategy on your side. The way the concurrent hits approach I'm taking allows you to hit at your pay grade. So that is, you treat your fights as equivalents, as a pool. So I have, as a hero, I have 4 attacks. So if I am attacking another hero who is defending as 4 attacks, that's going to reduce my pool by his 4. So I would roll to attack once. If it hits, it hits. If it misses, it misses. And that way it's up or down. And so this idea originally came to me reverse engineering something that Rob Conley over at Bat in the Attic had posted about a house rule he uses for swords and wizardry, where he gives fighters bonus attacks against low-level creatures because in AD&D you get an attack per level for zero level or normal men. So what he was doing was he was allowing an attack according to level, like an attack pool, against minions that are lower than you are. So I was like, okay, I have the opposite problem. So in Swords and Wizardry and an OD&D with the alternative combat system, you have too few attacks. You get like 1, or with the Mook rule, you get multiple. With Chainmail, when you have a higher man equivalence, you get too many attacks. It's rolling too much. And so I was like, okay, why don't we reverse this? And we'll say, I have an attack pool of 4. He has an equivalence of 4, and roll once. And that fits perfectly with the aesthetic of the fantasy combat table. So effectively, we recreate for higher level encounters a fantasy combat table without the need to expand the fantasy combat table. And so essentially it's just subtraction. It's okay, I have 4 attacks. There are zombies, they have 2 hit dice each. So I'll take away 2 for 2 rolls. But then with trolls and stuff, with trolls or with giants or with other high creatures, you have to hit you have to have your buddy hit them. So you can, if you're fighting against a 6 hit die monster, a hero may not necessarily be able to take them down the weapons versus armor, but if you have your wizard buddy backing you up, they get to roll too, and they can then overwhelm it on concurrent hits. And I loved the fantasy combat table because it's 1, mechanically fast, but 2, it's based on literature. It's not about okay, what rock, paper, scissors can I set up? No, it's based on Appendix N. So I talked about, I referenced the battle between Gandalf and the Balrog in Khazad Dûm up to Durin's Tower. That is in the Chainmail fantasy combat table. You have wizard versus the Balrog or flame demon, depending on whether you have the Tolkien sued me or not version. And But then you have, I mentioned Bard versus Smaug. I should probably get some non-Tolkien examples, but I figure your listeners will know these. So you have Bard versus Smaug. Your hero versus your dragon, you don't have a lot of chance in melee, but there's a caveat. If the hero has a bow, then you take him down, I think on a 7 or an 8. I forget which one.
Yep.
It might be an 8 for hero and a 7 for superhero. So you have that built into these games. The troll, here's a non-Tolkien example. Your troll versus hero. The troll has a better chance to kill other creatures, but heroes take them down. That's straight out of 3 Hearts and 3 Lions, where you have your Holger character, who is a hero. He's able to take the troll out because they figure out its weakness to flame. And then you fast forward to Broken Sword. There are trolls that are not true trolls, according to the fantasy matrix, but trolls are affected by magic weapons. Broken Sword, the elves use magic weapons. So the table is informed by Appendix N, and it's dedicated to creating the kind of experience that you have reading those books. Chainmail is designed around the creation of the Appendix N. So we talk about emergent narrative. Emergent narrative is the story that we tell at Waffle House after the fact to the other DMs about what our crazy players did. And that narrative is informed by both the mechanics and the choices that the players make. And OD&D is designed to feel like Appendix N. Chainmail is designed to feel like Appendix N. And I remember, Jason, this is something you've talked about on other shows and other calls. Subsequent D&D versions, they don't always do Appendix N very well, because you talk about Tower of the Elephant. That's the Conan story. That's not a party. That's Conan and the Zamoran thief breaking into the tower. And so it's effectively 2 dudes. That's not a party. That's 2 heroes. That's not a party. Similarly, you have the Broken Sword. Most of the book there's some mass battles at the beginning, but then most of the book is following around 2 people that are traveling together. And so Appendix N doesn't always follow the direction that OSR games tend to follow, where you have a dedicated party, you have different roles, different niches that are filled by different character classes. And so that's one of the attractive pieces of Chainmail, and working with Chainmail in your game is because it naturally guides towards that more fiction first or fiction finally, depending on the perspective, that comparatively to other games that a lot of folks have been introduced to the hobby through.
Definitely. And so you mentioned pathetic aesthetic, just to clear the air here, because we might have some callers, or I apologize, some listeners hollering at their cell phones or their device they're listening on. So to my knowledge, that term started with Andy Bartlett on a blog post in 2013, and I'll put that in the show notes, where it was probably most advertised or brought in the public consciousness these days is on the Monster Man podcast. Great podcast, everybody should listen to. And James did a special episode called The Pathetic Aesthetic that Edwin King, who's Diplomatist, he has his own blog and he's on various discords, but he had asked for that special episode on the pathetic aesthetic. And I think that, and that was in 2018, but I think that was probably where, I know that's the one that brought it to my attention initially. So,
yeah, Monster Man is great.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he's a great podcast. So I have a question. It's funny, I was doing narrative and then you went tech, and now you went narrative. I'm going to go tech. So when you have this situation, because now I'm intrigued, where you've got your troll that's 6 hit dice and you got your fighter that's 4 and your magic user that's 2, so they combine together, now they're 1 attack. Does that 1 attack kill the troll?
Yes. So essentially,
okay,
so I've got an injury table that I use. So it's not necessarily dead, but it will be out of action. But essentially, you have your if
defeated.
Oh, yep, it is defeated.
Yeah.
And so okay,
that's very interesting. I wonder. I'm super curious. Have you been using this? Because I haven't got all the way through Brass Cigarette. So
Yep, I did. We used the concurrent hits for the first time in the episode that's going live today. That is 9/7/2022. So we used concurrent hits for the first time. We're going to play it again with concurrent hits tonight. That should come out in the next week or so. I'm trying. I've gotten better at recording because I don't use the VTT for much. We have a party token that we move around. I just like the dynamic lighting. It helps the players to get involved, get immersed, and kind of do the mapping. It saves time because I don't have to describe and re-describe the room. So I use VTTs for.
Jason loves VTTs.
He does.
That's my favorite thing.
Yeah, I called in a bunch of times defending him, but yeah, I honestly don't really use them that much. I could have used Owlbear if it had dynamic lighting because I just don't. I was going to use Google Drive for character sheets, and it's a lot of the time I'll roll physical dice. I may actually borrow your multiple colored dice solution in the future because I let players roll a real dice if they want to. Because if you cheat on the roll, you're cheating yourself. And I've all of my players to date appreciate that. I've yet to play with someone who thinks that they need to roll high to win. And it's because if you fudge the dice as a player or as the ref, you've denied the emergent narrative. You've cheated, and it's not fun because in the absence of character skill, the primary driver behind the victory condition is player skill. Like with your 6 hit die example, they came in with a strategy. With some of the others example that I think I talked about was they came in. If you come in with a plan, and if you come in with I apologize, my children are yelling outside the office door. But it's knocking my mind. They can hear me talking, and so we put in a door. So when the pandemic hit, I had to start working remotely, as everyone who was able to work remotely could. But we put in a door to this room. It used to be just open, but we put in a door to prevent them from coming in and bothering me. They figured out that they can lie down on the floor and talk under the door to get my attention. And so
awesome.
Occasionally I'll just hear this heavy breathing in the background, and I look around and there's like baby hands coming out from under the door, like the undead trying to creep in around a barricade. But
they leveled up, right? They were OSR players. They figured out a way around it.
They did. They're using their player skill.
Just another thing about real dice, real quick. And I'll let you go on, but I always find it funny when people are like, "No, we need to use the virtual die roller, and we have to have virtual die rollers." When not everybody in the hobby, but 90%, 95%, 98% of the hobby collect dice. We spend how much money on dice, and we see fancy dice sets and we buy them, and we have piles and piles of dice. Why wouldn't you want to use your real dice? That's just where I come from on that. We have all these dice. Let's use them.
Well, I see two reasons. I'll be devil's advocate because I am also on the first surface. I have everybody roll dice. There's two reasons why I could see to do it. One is if you're doing an actual play and you want people that are watching to have that recorded thing. And the other reason would be if there's some kind of special die. I was once playing this game and I didn't quite understand it. It had kind of almost like Doom dice, I guess, and they had a way to track it. So as we were rolling, like it would add the Doom dice so everybody could see it on the. This was back in the Google Plus days, so it was some kind of extra thing they had added. So, which I didn't like because it was the first time I had ever played in a game online where they made me roll on the thing, and I was like, weird. But he had a very specific kind of die that he wanted to use. Those are two reasons I could possibly see. But again, I'm with you. I think that all my players generally roll. I mean, sometimes they'll just be like, I'll roll it here. Sometimes I roll on the roll 20 because it's easier for me. Sometimes I roll dice in front of me. I trust everybody at my table to not cheat in the game because you're cheating yourself, like Taylor said.
Yep, you are. And with OD&D, when you get into a pinch, a lot of the time the rules won't save you.
Exactly. Right. So this is really curious to me about this simultaneously or the because so now who rolls? So let's say you've got the magic user and the fighter, and the situation is one of the characters rolls, and then it's just a single hit, and they would roll independently. So the fighter would make the attack and he would roll and he would hit, and then that would qualify as 4 hits
towards the concurrent total because he attacks as 4 men. And so then you have a friend who rolls as, so say you have a magic user who only fights as 2 men, he would need to roll and hit and get him, or he could use a spell, but that's more down the road for the purposes of argument. Yeah. And so it's a pool that this effectively refreshes every round.
And each equivalent character's single hit is the equivalent of their maximum. Oh, that's an interesting way to do it.
Yep.
I guess the only downside is, this is why I'm asking. I'm not criticizing. I'm curious. Like, how does it play out if somebody wants to like parry and stuff? You just don't use that stuff because that takes some of your moves, right? Like,
yep. No one has asked yet. And so the way that I would have it play out, I do have the parry rules up on my DM screen. If they want to parry, they sacrifice an attack. However, at present, if they make an attack, then they would still hit according to their equivalents. But you got me thinking about that because I'm looking at the rule. The way parry works in man-to-man, if I've transcribed it correctly, is based on the length difference of your weapon. So if you have a weapon that is between 1 size category larger and 3 size categories smaller, then you forego an attack and your enemy suffers a -2 when trying to hit you. If it's between 7 and 4 smaller, then you have a chance to riposte. So you have a chance to strike back. So it hasn't come up in play yet, but now I'm curious. I may have a bad guy do it just to see how it plays.
Yeah, if they miss, because the way I do it is if they miss because of the parry, right? So if you're parrying and they miss, then you get an extra attack. So that it's a technique isn't really the word, but it's a approach that players have used in that's why I'm curious. Like, because one of the tense things is like, okay, you have 4 moves. How many attacks and how many parries do you want to do if you could do that, right? And then it's like, oh, okay, I'm fighting 3 guards. And I have 4 attacks. I'll attack twice and parry twice, hoping that at the most I'll get hit once, which isn't going to kill me, that kind of thing. And then so that's the reason why I like it. But if you remove that, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I was just curious how that would work with your.
Oh no,
I definitely like the simplification of the role. Yeah.
Yep, I would keep it absolutely, and I think it would come into play more frequently in the situation you describe, where, say, we have those 2 mooks who don't have a chance to hit me, and we haven't narratively offed them. So if I fight as 4 men and I'm fighting a normal adversary, because it only costs me 1 attack to strike a 1-hit die creature, then I can spend 2 parries and still get those 2 attacks. Or I could attack 4 times. And I've got a personal, internal rule. It hasn't come up yet, but my personal rule is if you're rolling more than 4, then let's dive over to the troop combat.
I was just thinking of that situation. But then also there could be, let's say, hero versus hero. 2 guys are fighting with swords, both in chainmail armor. How many parries you make versus how many attacks you make is relevant
very big
because you could decide I'm just going to attack them 4 times and hope that I hit them enough that hope that number 1 that I win initiative, because again, if the weapons are the same length, then you use initiative as your roll, so that will matter. Hope that I win initiative and kill them before they kill me, or I could say I'll do 2 and 2 to be safe, or I'll do 3 and 1 and really try to fight on the defensive. Like, where do I sit? And that's why I think it's interesting, and that's where it's come up, and it's a little bit more, which is why I think I tend to use it less, because it is a little bit more strategic when you're playing with a large group. It can be the slowest part. That's why I'm curious about how you do it.
It can.
Maybe that's
Unfortunately, though, now we're talking about it too, the cost to make the attack is equivalent to the impact you're making. So if I am a hero fighting another hero, I only roll the dice once to hit with potentially 4 attacks. Comparatively, if I am rolling to hit the little guy, then I would get to roll multiple times because he only has 1 hit die. Now that you mention it, if I parry 3 times and attack once, and I still hit for 4, then there's no reason I shouldn't parry 3 times. And when I'm going up against things, so yeah, I'm gonna have to think about that, because the first idea is spend the cost to parry in terms of the attacks you forego would have to scale with who you were parrying against. So it would be more of a conscious effort to parry something that was more dangerous. But
Right.
I'll have to think about
Right.
that.
Because what it would do in that situation is if you have 2 heroes that are both 4 hit dice, if somebody decided to parry, that means they're foregoing all of their attacks because they, I mean, based on how I'm seeing how it logically work out. Why would you do? I guess you might do it if you just hold them back and you don't want them to kill you.
Right.
But that just seems like maybe not the right thing to do.
Right.
Unless you really. Yeah.
The big thing for parrying is if you get that counter attack. If your weapon is to the point where you get that counter attack.
And because parrying factors in when you have something like a dagger, I don't have it in front of me, but I think a really short weapon like a dagger, you can often go first and get a counter attack, which makes a dagger a good weapon against certain situations. And why you might draw your dagger if it's as useful, let's say, as a sword against certain armor types. You'd be like, I'm going to use my dagger. It's going to let me go first.
Yep,
you drop your spear and that dagger gets you go first, and you get a second attack after they attack and they miss, and then it adds like a whole. Yeah, so there's a strategy in the man-to-man that's there. And again, that's the thing I've used the least. So it's like that's why I have so many questions about how you do it.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and it makes the fighting man the most complicated character.
100%, and it's very cool. And again, when I'm playing one-on-one, we've used it a lot. It's super cool. But in bigger groups, but then again, I also think, like, for instance, your magic user who's 4th level and only has 2 hit dice, they've only got 2 moves. And also limited weapons. So I guess it's not as complicated as a higher level fighter might be, where he's got, 6 attacks, and he might say something like, oh, well, I'm going to parry twice. I'm going to do this, so it's super interesting. Yeah. And I have one other question for that, because you mentioned using man-to-man for the mummies. Do you just give their hands like an equivalent, like maces or something? How do you handle that?
Yep. That's essentially exactly what I did. I have, for natural attacks, I have 4 types, I want to say, one of which is a bludgeoning type attack that's based off of a mace.
Nice.
I did. Yep, I did. I gave them a penalty on their length for the purposes of speed, because zombies are supposed to be slow. But yeah, essentially it was, I have 4 different weapon type attacks for natural attacks. So you have the bludgeoning types, which are more effective against heavy armor, because if you think about it, if I'm getting punched by a zombie, or if he's trying to claw at me like you see in the movies, then my plate armor isn't going to help that much. He's going to grab it and he's going to pull me up and try to close on me. Then comparatively, you have, say, a bite attack from Wildcat. There's a real story from a national park. I want to say it might have been I think it was in California. I forget where it was, but there was a little girl who was they went to a lake, and a little girl was wearing a life vest, like the old big yellow kind, the kind that we had when we were growing up, compared to the nice ones that they make for kids now. But the giant yellow kind that hangs around your neck. This little girl was attacked by a mountain lion, and the mountain lion bit on the back of her neck, the same as it would any other prey. But she had that giant foam life preserver. And so it shook her around a little bit, but it couldn't bite through the life preserver. And the parents ended up scaring it off. And she went home shaken, but unharmed. And so you have different, so the bite attack would be affected differently. So if I have that plate armor, if I have that heavy helmet, or if I have a male, then it will defend differently than if I have a male coif, or if I have a leather armor on, which, although theoretically, if you're getting struck by a mace, then it's going to hurt just as much through leather as it would through chain. I think part of the consideration there, where you have a weapon which may be more effective against heavy armor versus less effective against lighter armor, the trade-off is agility. So can I move? Because with leather, it's more designed to deflect ablative blows. So I'm being struck by something, but I've moved out of the way and it's catching some of it. And so you have a lot more dexterity in boiled leather than you would in, say, Assyrian epoch scale mail, which is heavier and a little clumsier. And so there's a give and take in that regard in how the table is set up.
Yeah, I agree with that. But now there's going to be one comment below linking to that YouTube video with the guy swimming in plate mail armor. So get ready for that.
Yeah, doing cartwheels. Yeah,
doing cartwheels, right?
Yep, always. And to which I reply, that is why your encumbrance is what determines your move speed, not your armor.
Right.
So
definitely.
yeah, and also they're running a 5-minute course and not wearing plate mail for 8 hours and then suddenly getting into combat in the middle of a dungeon.
Yeah.
But anyways, that's it. But somebody always posts a video like that whenever you mention armor be like
Yep,
plate
yep,
being
I
slower
always-
than leather.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
always post that video. I'm that guy.
Right.
You're the guy.
that's, yeah. Well, that's like, the weight of swords and a lot of times games don't mirror exactly, but a lot of it is encumbrance isn't like a scale, the weight on the scale. The encumbrance is how bulky it is. It's a mixture of the weight plus the bulkiness, right? So
Yep, it is.
I would say I always assume, I guess, but it very rarely comes up in play. So that like when you get into a combat, like you drop your bags and stuff, you're fighting, right? Like that's what we're trained to do in the army, right? Like you drop your bag, you don't have it on your back. When you get down, right? So like that's what I imagine characters doing. So that's why I don't really worry too much about that in combat, but I use the armor as movement speed because I also think that's a balancing point, right? Because if you can move just as fast in plate as you can in leather, then why would you ever not wear plate?
Right.
Especially when it's only
if-
60 gold pieces in OD&D.
Well, that's the other thing. Yeah, when you look at the costs of things, but again, it's not the real world. It's fantasy.
No,
world,
it's not. It's a fun game, and it gets a way to balance things out.
Definitely.
That's why clerics are really, really powerful at OD&D. It's funny how powerful they are. Like, they're almost as good as a fighter up to like the first like few levels as far as like scaling, and they can use the same armor. And if you're using OD&D rules where every weapon does a D6 and it doesn't matter what armor you're wearing because you use the alternate combat system, then a cleric is a much better fighter than a fighter up to like about third level. Which again, it shows you where chainmail comes in because the fighter's ability to use all these extra weapons really makes them more powerful. The two-handed swords, the daggers, all that stuff just works better against different types of monsters. And so unless you're going to make up your own rules for that, why bother? They're already there, right?
Right.
So,
and that's why fighters get the advantage of magic swords and whatnot too.
Oh, and magic swords. Yeah, that's the big deal. I guess magic swords are super common. I rolled a random treasure thing for this wizard and his henchmen, and I think like 7 of his henchmen had magic swords. And of course, the party took them out very cleverly, so they ended up with a whole ton of magic swords. Like, what are we gonna do with all these magic swords? I'm like, it's OD&D. You have a lot of magic swords, so they started giving them to their henchmen and stuff. But that's it. That's how it balances out.
Yeah, and that's kind of funny too, because the magic weapons are, as we were talking about earlier, with the 2d6 curve, that +1 is a big deal. Magic weapons are a big deal, but magic swords are super common, and so it's a matter of making your magic items, which this isn't necessarily by the book, but it's the idea of let them do neat things, but not just necessarily just pluses, right? And I'm a fan of unique magic weapons, which if possible, as opposed to your, where you go to the magic shop on the corner and, can buy and trade magic items willy-nilly, right?
Yeah, I'm with you on that. The way I'm running this current campaign is like, we're kind of going back to what Taylor was saying, I'm running it close to the book. So if I roll treasure and they get a bunch of magic swords, I'm just giving it to them because I want to see how it plays out. But it does make a big difference. But, surprisingly, it's not that much of a game breaker. You have to consider that you can only use one magic sword at a time. Most magic swords in my campaign anyways are intelligent, which means they're not going to want you to have a second one. So like, because one of the characters was like, oh, I have 2 swords and I can use them. I'm like, well, your first sword has a high ego. It doesn't want you to take that sword. If you would dice off against it, they were like, oh no, I'll keep the sword I have. I don't want to be controlled by my sword, and it was fine. So they gave it to a henchman, and now the henchman is super loyal because they have a magic sword, and such is life. And I think that works out pretty well.
Right. No, I think so.
So at first, when I went to OD&D, this is one of the things I mentioned at the very beginning. I thought, well, I'll just change the combat system, and it's a tag on. And I see this is what a lot of people do. But when you actually start going into it, you have to think about if you change the combat system, a lot of the spells are affected by it. Things like bless or hold person, and these kind of spells have very specific effects, or maybe not hold person, but based on like they give bonuses to armor, or like protection from evil was a big one, right? It's like, what does it actually do, right? In a case where you're using this other system. So it does make you have to dig in, even with the simple system, and say, if I'm changing the combat system, that +1 with bless is a lot more powerful than it, let's say, is in a system where it's with D20, or that protection from evil where they fight as a lower hit die. That makes a big difference too. Like, how would that affect, how you're fighting there? And I think that's super interesting. And I do use that, by the way. So like, if a monster is affected by protection from evil, and they're supposed to fight as 1 hit die less, then what I actually do is if the cleric hits them and scores enough damage to kill them minus that 1 hit die, they will defeat that creature, even though it has more hit die than but only the cleric will be able to do that because or whoever has to pick people spell up. And it's really interesting. Again, it makes clerics very, very cool.
Right. I remember back on your show when you started kind of getting into this and talking through having to adapt all the spells to use with chainmail, going through and having to effectively rewrite that. And the same thing with monsters, having to adapt all the monsters for use to fit in the tables.
Right. And what's interesting too that I'm finding, and I haven't encountered it too much, so we're kind of playing it out, is things like Fireball, right? If you're going to do hit dice, right? And a Fireball does 6 hit die dice, does it just kill anything that's 6 hit die? That was my original thought, right? Because in OD&D, a save versus spell against a Fireball gives you either no effect or full effect. Like it's all or nothing. Against wands and stuff, you do half damage, and against dragons. But so then you get this Fireball spell, which is really powerful, because if you're throwing a Fireball, anything 6 hit dice or less that's affected by it that doesn't make a saving throw is dead. And it's really kind of, I haven't had it happen too much in play, but it's one of those things where you got to be real careful, because that enemy wizard is going to take out your whole party that it took them 6 months to build up with one single spell. And, if they fail to save, that is. Mm-hmm. So I'm still debating how I'm going to handle things like that kind of stuff. I'm going to play it out different ways. At first, I was doing the all or nothing, and now I'm thinking I might do something to the effect of using the hit points for stuff like that. But again, I'm up in the air on that.
Yeah,
so I'm curious.
Have you thought about that? How you're going to adapt spells over?
I have a little bit, and that actually leads into a question I was going to ask. I remember you had an episode, Daniel, where you talked about chainmail wizards versus OD&D wizards. Have you stuck with the Vancian approach? And I think there was some Vancian magic in some of the actual plays that you had done with OD&D, but I will admit I have not been watching as many APs as I used to. So I've fallen behind on some of the things that you had put up on the channel.
I have not done that many, so you're not missing out on much. I did a really good Boot Hill one, though, so check that out. Yes, I've been keeping it Vancian again for this campaign, but in the Unchained game that I'm making, the secondary game, I'm going to use the chainmail magic. Because what happened was, I was like, how interesting is it going to be a magic user if you really can't cast a spell, right? Because this is the big thing, right? This is, you see people come into the OSR and they're like, magic users suck because they cast their one spell and they can't do anything. So it's like, now I'm going to create a system where you can only really use these spells during battles, and you need like a ton of dirt to summon an earth elemental, which is crazy powerful. But how often are you going to be able to do that? Mm-hmm. But in my playtest where somebody played a seer and I allowed them to have some of those other abilities, the counter spell, the detecting magic, some of that other stuff, the character was actually almost more interesting because they couldn't cast spells. They were just knowledgeable about magic. And I like that route. If you're going to play in a more low magic world, they're not running around casting spells left and right, but they can counterspell. Like there was a device that went off and it was like going to basically kill everybody. And they were able to use their counterspell to stop it when everybody ran through the room, stuff like that. And I found that to be really powerful. So to answer the question, I guess somewhat subtly, is that right now I'm playing OD&D with chainmail bolted on, and I am staying Vancian. But I plan on doing more stuff with the Unchained game where it's going to not be Vancian and going to be more ritualistic for the most part. Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, very cool. Yep. I have not forayed too much, to answer your question, Jason, into the differences in casting. I love the chainmail magic system, in part because, like Daniel was describing, you have these big effects and it leads to some very interesting stuff. And there's certain abilities that wizards have in chainmail that in later editions of the D&D game turned into spells. So for example, wizards are immune to missile fire in chainmail. Mm-hmm. There is a spell in D&D, I forget the name of it. Is it
protection from normal missiles?
Protection from normal missiles. Yep. Thank you. That's. I think that's.
I just used it in a game. That's why.
Yeah, I think that's literally what it is called too in the Chainmail book. So they took certain things that the wizard just innately could do and turned it into spells, and that makes sense from the resource management game. It's the packing your toolkit approach, and so it's a part of the design. But when you think about them as class features, also that's interesting. That creates a new archetype that's fun to explore.
It does. And it also prevents that thing I mentioned earlier where like when the wizard stays back out of combat, but then the DM just has a goblin shoot him with a bow anyways, that kind of thing. Or the party does that, right? They're fighting the minions up front and they're like, no, we won't fight them. We're going to shoot a bow at the wizard way in the back. We're going to kill him. Well, guess what? He's immune to normal missiles. You can't do that. You got to get up there if you want to fight him, that kind of thing. Or use magic missiles.
Yep. Absolutely. And again, that's not something I've worked on too much. Currently, my game is full on standard Vancian at the moment. I do have some ideas I want to apply to Clerics. Namely, so one of the things I was trying to do was give each magic source a unique feel. With magic users and clerics, they operate under the same principle of tools in a toolbox. You get X number of spells, and then you use them. And the lists are different, which give a different flair and a different feel and a different utility. But what I wanted to do was give it a different execution at the same time. And so for clerics, what I wanted to try was, in addition to being able to call miracles down from their patron deity, they may also be able to get certain things or have role play incentives. So you to access the second tier of miracle, you have to abide by a particular taboo. And so that would, you could have a cleric that started out one way, and then based on the taboos and prescriptions of the deity to earn favor with the deity, and that was one of the mechanics I was trying to balance. Is you would instead of you would earn the equivalent, so a spell slot, so to speak, you would earn that by doing things in character that would be predetermined beforehand. Because I think I mentioned this at some point, but I'm not a fan of arbitrary role play rewards. When you do that, it becomes a game of who can make the DM laugh the most, and they'll get the bonus XP. But when you have that written in advance, it's like, okay, these are some check boxes that if you do this in role play, then you get this outcome. It becomes more empirical, and it's less of a subjective thing where you end up, rewarding all of the spells to the DM's wife.
Right. Yeah, no, definitely. Well, I mean, first of all, you should do that.
I can't for the life of me get her to play. Honestly, she loves puzzle games. I tried to get her to come in playing the thief class. She came, she observed a couple games actually back when I was playing in college, but I never got my wife to play. It just wasn't her thing. Yeah, she said it wasn't what I thought it would be. Yeah.
I have a friend like that. Like I thought he would love D&D, and he loved video games. He loves fantasy, whatever. He played twice. He's like, it's not for me. I just don't really like it. So, I mean, it's probably because I'm a terrible DM. But that's a whole other podcast. Yeah. But what I was going to say about the cleric. In Oriental Adventures book, I think the Wujen, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, they have something like that. And I think that is super interesting. They have taboos that they have to follow in order to, if they don't, then they basically, in typical AD&D fashion, if they don't do it, they lose something, versus if they do it, they gain something, right? So it's like you pick something like, I can't cut my hair or whatever, and then if that happens, then you don't get spells that day or however long. So I love that idea. I think it's a great idea, and it adds a lot of flavor for sure.
Right.
And you can do different deities. I mean, I only have one deity in my world, Astor, the god of sheep herders. So I don't know exactly what they would do, but maybe something to do with sheep.
Yeah, they're only allowed to wear wool clothing.
That's right.
Right. Yeah. Well, we'll have to explore that. We're coming up on 2 hours, so we're going to wind down. But I hope both of you will be open to coming back on at some point, and we'll look for, and definitely we'll have links to all your shows, all your things in the show notes, and people can follow your progress as you guys go down. So the goal is, I think, eventually for your projects, which are kind of being developed independently, they're going to be released, right? Daniel, I think you were talking about Drive Through RPG. Was that?
I'm definitely going to release the Unchained, which is going to be the one that's strictly built off Chainmail as a Chainmail as a chassis. This month, it's September now, right? So possibly by the time this comes out. That is my goal. I've set a goal, because if you don't put a date, you never do it. Is kind of what I've learned in life. So it's mostly done. I think I was talking shade when I said it last time, so I won't say it now. But I read a bunch of rule sets when I was at Gen Con, and I looked at them and I was like, "Yeah, I should just release you're worried that like what you produce isn't going to be good or written really well because I'm not a professional writer. But the reality is that it's fun to play. And I think if people want to enjoy the game, then they will. And if I have some, don't use the biggest words in the world, or I can't write as well as, Gygax or whatever, then so be it. You get the Daniel language. But yeah, this hopefully this month we'll have that out and we'll play it because I'm really enjoying it. I am. This has been a really interesting and just to wind up on one last thing there is that because I know a lot of people look at these games and this is a very common thing, like, well, it's just nostalgia. That's why I think they're good. But I did not play OD&D or Chainmail when I was a kid. I'd never played it until I was an adult. So I'm not having any kind of memories. It's like this is literally something brand new for me that I discovered after seeing Jason Via's work.
Yep, same here. Because I saw the miniatures, but I never got to play the game. And finding Chainmail was a big new thing. And if the OSR is an attempt to reproduce a romanticized version of our own entry into the hobby to recreate that sort of rapt fascination, this is doing it for me.
Yeah, for sure.
So is you are looking to release your product at some point, Taylor?
Eventually, yep. So currently I do have the playtest document up on the blog that folks can just grab Google Docs. I'm going to, it's really overdue for a revision. Some of the stuff I talked about doing and that we've doing on the YouTube is not documented in the work, but it'll get there eventually. I'll probably throw it up on Drive-Thru. Folks love it. I'll probably throw it up also on the Big Geek Emporium, in part because Randy, one of the guys behind it, and Joe, they're friends of my podcast, but also I love the principle they're founding that on. That is that game is more important than creator, and it's keep the world out, focus on the game, and come together based on a common love of the adventure. So I may do that as well.
Excellent.
Cool.
Excellent. Well, we'll look forward to seeing that. And like I say, hopefully you guys will be willing to come back on Cerebravore, maybe to talk about Chainmail, maybe to talk about something else. Who knows?
Absolutely.
You're always welcome.
Fourth edition.
Yeah. Hey, you know what? Fourth edition. Well, we won't get into it here, but fourth edition is not all bad. I actually go back and look at it.
Based on what people were saying about fourth edition, I had to buy it to look, and if I flip through it, it looks pretty good. I will eventually get it to the channel. It looks like a pretty cool little system. I mean, I didn't buy like the 7 different players handbooks they have for it, but I have the core set.
I love fourth edition. It's what introduced me to the OSR.
Yeah, there you go. The biggest sin of fourth edition, arguably, is that it's called D&D, right? Not well, and I don't mean, and that's kind of a backhanded comment, but actually, if it was the World of Warcraft role playing game, or if it was nothing, if it was just called something different, people wouldn't have come in expecting something else, right? And because they said, we're going to change and update the system, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's okay to try new things, but just the name, the name is caused. I can't.
Yeah, it came with some expectations.
Yeah, it came with expectations that, and I think people just needed or wanted to see certain things in D&D they weren't seeing there, and that that caused problems. So
and that's why we have Pathfinder.
That's right, and that's why we have Pathfinder. So, okay. Well, now that my foot's in my mouth, I'm going to close this out. Thank you again, gentlemen. I really appreciate your joining. Like I say, I'll get with you. We'll have links to all the things in the show notes, and we'll talk to you again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Delve on.
A nerd simple broadcast, Cerebravore podcast. Let's savor all the flavors from the sign of Capstrong. All stars and pods past, Cerebravore podcast. You're counting down your last as you admire them all. Something's playing teeth, or so it's in your brain. But